Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Week 7 lecture, where we are going to be discussing the functional impact, recommendations, and appendices sections of the assessment report. So, in weeks 5 and 6, we really focused on the intake interview, how to write the background section, and then how to actually score an assessment. And when you were scoring an assessment, you were providing a client with the quantitative information about their whatever they're presenting you with. They're presenting concern or whatever they're choosing to be assessed for. That's what you were giving them in the assessment scoring section. In the functional impact recommendations sections, you're really providing your client with the qualitative information about what's going on for them. So let's go into a little bit more detail on what that means. So, in an assessment report, depending on the agency, you might see this section labeled a little bit differently. For myself, I typically call this the functional impacts section of the report because I'm literally taking the client's assessment information and I'm putting it in the context of their real world, how they function in a day-to-day world and how it impacts their daily functioning. By some agencies, they'll just call this their summary section. In fact, in the assessment report that I provided to you as an example, this section is under the summary section. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that section is so small in your sample report here in a minute. But let's go into a little bit of detail about the purpose of this section. I've already alluded to this a little bit, but one of the main purposes of the functional impact section is to provide your client with qualitative descriptions that match the quantitative scores that you provided to them in the assessment results section. But the other primary focus is to interpret the client's scores in the context of their life. Talk about how whatever diagnoses you are rendering for them, whatever symptoms make up that diagnosis, how those things impact your client's daily functioning. What might the client expect this diagnosis to look like in their day-to-day life? And giving them the information that they need to be able to accommodate that so that they can make informed decisions moving forward given this information that they are learning about themselves through the assessment process. The general format of a functional impact or summary section typically follows the same format for most assessment results, but typically you follow the order that you went in for the assessment results section. So if you talked about substance use assessment results first, and then you talked about social emotional results, your functional impact is going to follow a similar format. You are going to give a functional summary of their substance use assessment, a functional assessment of their socio-emotional assessment, and then or socio-emotional functioning, and then you're probably going to provide a small small summary of those combined, how they're integrated with one another. And as I already mentioned, you're going to integrate the information together. So a lot of times when we think about diagnoses in the DSM, they're written out as separate diagnoses. You have depression. You have a personality disorder. You have a substance use disorder. And they're even in different sections in the DSM. But as human beings, these diagnoses are not static. They don't just like keep in their boxes and don't interact with one another. We're human and these things interact with each other. These diagnoses, the symptoms, they all come together and they're going to impact someone's life uniquely. So this functional impact section is where we can say, okay, based on all of these pieces that we're pulling together, here's what it probably looks like all together for you in your daily functioning. And the reason why the sample report that I provided to you doesn't have a functional impact statement is because some agencies may omit this section altogether if they do not render any diagnoses for the client. This is definitely an agency specific thing, so you really need to check with the agency at which you are conducting an assessment. But the idea here is that you need to make sure that if you are not including any information here, that you are providing justification for why to the client in your feedback session, which we'll be talking about in week 8 of this course. But I want to give you an example of what a functional impact summary might look like. So granted, this is a de-identified example from a child ADHD assessment that I conducted, which is undoubtedly different from a substance use assessment, but it gives you a general template of the content that you might include in a functional impact summary section. So typically you're going to start by going into detail on the client's overall presentation. A lot of times in substance use assessments, this first paragraph is going to be omitted just for simplicity because it's not necessary in the report, but it almost depends on the client. If a client is being mandated to receive their substance use assessment, it might be helpful to include a little bit on their presentation if they were easy to get along with, if they were engaging in the process, because that may give the court system information that they need about this client through the process. So use your judgment on that. Talk with the client, talk with your supervisors, see if that's important information to include. But then you'll see in general, each paragraph then relates to different categories of the assessment. General strengths in the person's performance, areas where they showed a little bit more of a weakness or a growth edge, and how that might show up in their daily lives. So for this person, it's saying, well, you have a little bit of a slower processing speed. So when you're asked to process information quickly and verbally, you may struggle, and it may show up as difficulties with memory or not paying attention in school or needing extra time on assignments. And that's sort of what you would expect is, okay, now I'm going to go into each category of what this means for the client. The next one that I have is general things that we see, general difficulties that we see with ADHD, which really could be combined with the previous paragraph. And then following that up with taken together with the other diagnoses that we rendered, here's how it shows up in the client's life. So in a substance use assessment, this might look like a general summary that the client was engaging, they tried hard on the assessments, they got everything done in a timely manner, and it was clear that they were invested in the process because of the work that they're doing or the assessments that they completed. Then the next paragraph might go into, it's clear that this client is making efforts to change their substance use patterns as evidenced by receiving an assessment, coming into counseling, going to AA meetings, like whatever it is, and saying even with these adjustments, the client is still experiencing difficulties related to their substance use. For example, they are showing elevated scores in defensiveness, which may show up as X, Y, and Z in their life. And then you might have another paragraph that says, this client has persevered through many tremendous difficulties and traumatic experiences, such as, and providing examples that are appropriate to the client. Given that, it makes sense that the client is also being diagnosed with this emotional or trauma-related disorder. And in the context of their life, when coupled with the substance use diagnosis, this might look like, or this might appear as X, Y, and Z in the client's life. And you really get to make this functional impact an example of what the client is experiencing so that when they give this report to someone else, that person gets a pretty comprehensive view of what your client is experiencing based on the summary that you provided. So that's what your functional impact summary section is going to entail. The next section that follows the functional impact is the recommendations or referrals section. Again, both of these are included in this section, and it's up to the agency on which title you use, because typically a lot of agencies will just refer to this as the recommendations section and then include the referrals, and some will actually say, nope, we need you to say recommendations and referrals. It just sort of depends. But typically, this is the section of your assessment report that is the easiest to write. In my opinion, it is the easiest to write because most of the content in this section can be copied and pasted across multiple reports. What's going to happen is the more substance use assessments that you complete, the more of a sort of recommendation and referral sort of bank you are going to create. You are just going to get this running list of recommendations that you have for people, this running list of groups that are available, individual therapies, inpatient groups, like whatever it looks like. You're going to get this ongoing list of recommendations and referrals. And then when you do another assessment, you might be able to say, oh, like this person's diagnoses and experiences are similar to this person, so I'm going to copy and paste these ones, but they're also similar to this other person that I did, so I'm going to look at what differences I had for them and copy those over as well. And if you're working for an agency, sometimes you can borrow or steal recommendations and referrals from other colleagues. Like maybe this is the very first substance use assessment that you've ever completed. That's okay. You might ask a colleague for a template of their own reports so that you can follow a similar format, and you might borrow some of the content from theirs, or they might even tell you like, hey, copy as much out of this as you need, because there's no point in reinventing the wheel. At least in my experience working with clinicians in the world, they are more than willing to share resources and referrals and recommendations because they know what it's like to be an early clinician when you're building those resources. So a lot of times you can sort of lean on your colleagues and your fellow professionals for a little bit of support here. So the general format for your recommendations and referrals section is that you're going to provide specific recommendations for each clinical diagnosis that was rendered. So you'll go into a little bit of detail on each of them, and depending on the client's needs and what they want out of the referral, you can include specific referrals in the client's community. So if during the intake, when you ask them, what do you hope to get out of this assessment? If they say, I want to get better connected to resources that are going to be specifically tailored to what I'm experiencing, this is the context where you can say, here are some referrals in the community for someone with this diagnosis. Here are specific therapy modalities that might be helpful for someone with this diagnosis. So you'll provide those referrals in that section. Then you're going to provide some general health recommendations that you can tailor to the client. These general health recommendations are not always included in substance use assessments. This tends to be a recommendation section that is included for people who have experience doing assessments in other categories, so neuropsych assessments, psychodiagnostic assessments, but I don't want to overshadow the importance of general health in someone's mental health, their physical health, their substance use. General health matters. So I want to encourage all of you to also include these general health recommendations in your assessment reports because they are helpful for our clients. And if we make space to talk about them, it gives the client an opportunity to let these be a focus in their lives. So I have these on here as general health recommendations because I want you to copy these out of the assessment report that I gave to you. I actually copied them in from my own reports because they're the exact same ones that I use. But you can tailor them to your client. And I'll show you a little bit more of what that looks like here in a minute, but make sure that you're making them make sense to your client. And then if necessary, or if your client would find it beneficial, you can offer book recommendations to your client on their diagnosis or their presenting concern, whatever it is. You really get to tailor the books to the client. They're not always helpful for everyone. Not every client benefits from books, or they can tell you like, absolutely not, I'm not going to read it. And that's okay. Then you can omit this section. But some people really like reading. They like the resources. It provides them with an opportunity to do some work internally on themselves, in addition to the work that they might be doing in therapy or in groups or in their community. So offer them if necessary or beneficial. And then you end the recommendations and referrals section with an identified conclusion sentence that appears on your signature page. So when I say an identified conclusion sentence, it means that you put the client's name in the conclusion sentence and saying, and I'll provide an example of this, of X and like Lucky Arkfeld, whoever it is, I'm just using my last name as an example, was a wonderful person to work with, and they should reach out if they ever have any questions. And then below that, you have your signatures for yourself and your supervisor if necessary, depending on your supervision. And that is in there for a reason, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on that here in a minute. So let's go break down each of these sections. So as I mentioned, the first section that you're going to include is specific recommendations for the diagnoses that you rendered. So here's an example of what that might look like. And this is pulled from the substance use assessment sample report that I provided to you, where you might say, okay, based on your diagnoses, sometimes people benefit from counseling or therapy. It can be considered an incredibly helpful tool for navigating the highs and lows of substance use or of depression or of trauma or whatever it is that you're diagnosing your client with. And you can say, based on that, here are some referrals that might be helpful to help the client address these concerns identified in this report. And then you provide specific example or specific referrals for those diagnoses. And these can overlap. Like if you are giving someone a diagnosis for substance use, but you're also giving them a personality disorder diagnosis, you can provide referrals for both. You can have one clinical behavioral suggestion that covers both of those categories, depending on the client. You really get to tailor that to the client. But again, you probably have a list of resources of general clinicians in the community, people who specialize in different things, and you can use that as an opportunity to sort of tailor the services that you're providing. A good rule of thumb for all referrals that you provide to a client is that you always give 3 or more referrals in each category. So if you were going to split up your referrals and say, here are therapy referrals, here are psychiatry referrals, and here are group therapy referrals, a good rule of thumb is to provide 3 referrals in each section. Absolutely no fewer than 2 referrals in each section. And the reason why you do that is because you want the client to have options, and you don't want to just say, oh, I only found 2, so I'm only going to give you 2, because if you can only find 2 as a clinician, how many do you think your client is going to find when they don't always know what to search for online or which links to open up? You want to give them options so that they know what to look for. They have examples, because if they have 3 examples to go off of, they can narrow down their search terms a little bit better. So make sure that you keep that in mind, that when you're providing a referral, always provide 3 or more, but you don't want to overwhelm the client, so don't offer too many. Like this one has 6 therapy referrals. That is absolutely, definitely like my max in giving a client referrals for therapy. I never want to exceed 6 referrals on anything in my experience, but that might be different for someone else. So after you have your clinical and behavioral suggestions, then you go into your general health recommendations. And again, I encourage you to copy this into your own reports if you want. I think it's a fantastic section to include in reports, where it really goes into the importance of sleep, movement, and nutrition on our health and well-being, and what you can do as a client to improve your health and well-being in these areas. And this section, oftentimes I copy and paste it into my reports, and then every now and then I'll change things to meet my client's needs. So for example, I might change the movement section that says, oh yeah, you can go walking, dancing, yoga, hiking, all those sorts of things as examples. If I have a client who's super active, I might say, continue skiing, snowboarding, dirt biking, like continuing your current level of exercise. Whereas if I have someone who is completely new to exercising, I don't want to put things like hiking and going skiing and snowboarding. It might say like taking walks in the evening or choosing the stairs instead of an elevator, things like that. You really get to tailor it to your client depending on what you know about them. And then after your general health recommendations, you follow that up with your book recommendations, again, if necessary or beneficial for your client. And just saying, here are some book resources that might be helpful for individuals who are navigating situations that are similar to yours. And I always put this note in here that not all of the resources or book recommendations that you provide are helpful for every person. Some people find them really helpful and other people find them really difficult. In those situations, it's always best to have a professional to help you navigate that situation, especially if the book referrals are not helpful. And similar to your referrals, a good rule of thumb is to never give fewer than 2 book referrals, but 3 to 4 book referrals is ideal. Here, I only provided 2, but you get the idea that you want to have more of those options available to your client. And then you end this section with your identified conclusion sentence and your signature page. So here is the exact example of a conclusion sentence where you say, "It has been a pleasure working with," and you include the client's name. And you say, "We wish them the best in their future, and please do not hesitate to contact us with questions regarding this evaluation." This sentence always appears on your signature page. In fact, I encourage you all to edit your assessments so that there is a page break right before this sentence, so that no matter how much content you have before this sentence will always be at the start of its own page. And the reason why is because you should never, as a clinician, put your signature page by itself without any identifying information. Because if it's just a page with your signature on it, someone can cut and paste that information or take that signature page and slap it on whatever report that they want and say it came from you when it didn't. But if you put in this identified sentence, something that has a client's name in it, then it prohibits the abilities to be able to do that, because it becomes very obvious that the document has been tampered with. So again, I always use it as a good rule for myself that this sentence is always right after a page break so that it appears on its own page, and it always has the client's name on it to specify that this signature is in response to this assessment report. And then after you have concluded your recommendations and referrals section, the last part of your assessment report is the appendices. And generally speaking, you will have at least one appendix for your scoring tables, where you are going to write out the exact scores that someone got on all of the assessments that you provided to them. So having their PHQ-9 score, their GAD-7 score, their scores on the PCL-5, and their scores on the SASE-4 for our assessment example. So you will always have at least one, generally you will have at least one appendix to have the raw scoring tables. Some agencies may move the background history information into an appendix to streamline the report. This is incredibly agency specific. I've worked at agencies that do have that section separate. I've worked at agencies that have it in the body of the assessment report, and it just varies depending on the individual who's paying to turn the lights on at that agency. So you really get to decide, but again, it can sometimes include other things, but if you're not including the background information, another common appendix that you might see is diagnosis specific handouts. So if you're giving a diagnosis that has a specific handout that's associated with it, this is really common for child assessments that are done or adolescents, where you might have handouts for parents. You might include that in an appendix so that the parents have that information. And oftentimes the appendices are read by other professionals, specifically your scoring tables. Oftentimes your client isn't the person who is flipping through the score tables to see what their actual scores were, but other professionals do. Other clinicians will look at that information because they know how to interpret that information. So keep that in mind as you're writing that section. But the general format for your appendices is that you are always going to have them appear after your signature page. And then after the signature page, you're going to begin with a table that explains how to interpret scores in a scoring table. And for our assessment, we are only putting the scoring tables in the appendices. If you have the background information in an appendix, if you have specific handouts, those typically appear after the scores table. Again, it's agency specific. But for this class, your appendix A will be your scoring table, and it will always start with a table that explains how to interpret the scores in the table. So here's an example of what that might look like. You have a title that says Appendix A, this is your test scores, and then you have a note that says, here's how to interpret the scores here. If you see a standard score, this is what the average is, this is the standard deviation, scaled score. This is the mean and standard deviation, t-score, so on and so forth. If you see asterisks beside something, this is what it means. You're almost providing your client with a little key for interpreting their scores, and then you provide those scores in the client's report. So we'll go into a little bit more information of what this looks like, but I have provided to you a document of blank scoring tables that you can use in your assessment report for this class. So we'll go into a little bit more information here as we transition to talking about the assignment, the third writing assignment for this class, which is going over these exact sections that we just discussed: the functional impact, recommendations, and appendices. So to start, I want you to go back and look at the diagnoses that you rendered for your client and the feedback that you received on the second writing assignment. Through the diagnoses that you rendered and the feedback that you got, you will then write a functional impact or qualitative summary of the client's assessment results. So putting the client's results in the context of their life, given their symptoms, how they interact with one another, how they are integrated to one another, what might the client expect in their day-to-day life? Then you're going to draft and provide recommendations and referrals to the client. And you're going to do that in a couple of areas. You're going to have the clinical recommendations and referrals. Some of those you will create for yourself. Some of those you can copy and paste from the referral base that I gave you in the sample report. I do encourage you to use this opportunity to start building clinical referrals and recommendations in the community where you plan to work. I know the client in this example is saying that they're from Colorado and that they're around here, but if you plan to work in a different state beyond Colorado, I encourage you to use this as an opportunity to find referrals in your community. Start building your own clinical referral and recommendation database for yourself that you can start using for your own assessment reports. Follow up those clinical recommendations and referrals with general health recommendations and referrals. Again, feel free to copy those from the example report that I made for you and tailor them to your client, and then provide the book recommendations. After that, add your identified summary sentence and signature page, and then draft Appendix A, your scoring tables for the client. Again, I provided you with blank scoring tables that you can copy and paste into your report and then fill out. So those are available to you on Canvas. When you open the assignment instructions for this assignment, you'll see a hyperlink to the blank scoring tables. Go ahead, open that, copy the tables into your assessment report, fill them out, and then save the document. So that way you have them as blanks if you want to use them in another assessment report that you're doing down the road, or just to have in general. I'm fine with that. But definitely use those. Reach out if you have questions about it, and we'll give you a little bit more of an indication of what that looks like in the feedback. And then I want to just reiterate, as always, this assignment is worth 10 points and is due at 11:59 p.m. on Sunday of week 7. So make sure that you're working on this section ahead of time, and this will be the last section that you draft before the final integrated report is due, where you're going to be integrating all of the feedback that was provided to you into a comprehensive singular assessment report. And as always, keep in mind that though this is a draft, you are still expected to submit a fully developed and well-written document, and you'll receive detailed feedback on how to further improve your report, and your grade will be based on the effort that you put in, as well as your ability to cover all of the required components of that section. And then, as I already briefly mentioned, the final integrated report will be graded on your overall writing quality, as well as how well you implemented the feedback that was provided to you. So that is where we are going to wrap up our lecture for chapter 7, which I know is not for chapter 7, for week 7. I know this is a little bit shorter than our previous 2 weeks, and I hope that is a nice welcome because I know you all are working so incredibly hard, and this has been a wild summer, and I know that you have a lot on your plates, so I hope that you are learning a lot in this course, and I will see you all in the next lecture.